to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet at the Hudson Institute. We have a wonderful program today with Professor Tom Hazlett of George Mason University. Before we begin the program, I just want to mention a couple of things. One is our next seminar will be on Monday, March 5th, here again at the Hudson Institute. We're very pleased to have David Rifkin, who is one of the leading authorities on the Patriot Act, who will be discussing the Patriot Act and its implications for the Internet. Today, we're pleased to have a live video stream, and for our video audience, for those of you who have questions for Professor Hazlett, you can tweet them, and instructions can be found at the Hudson site about the address to tweet those to. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Professor Tom Hazlett of George Mason University. Professor Hazlett has had a distinguished career and specializing in the economics of telecommunications. He has served as chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission. He has published countless articles on telecommunications, and he's particularly the world's greatest expert on what to do with broadcast spectrum, which is the topic of today's discussion. And the format we're going to do today is going to be just sort of a fireside chat here with Professor Hazlett. And I'd like to divide the discussion today in sort of two parts. One is, in Professor Hazlett's view, what the appropriate way to deal with broadcast spectrum, current inefficiencies, how it could be better allocated, how to get there most efficiently, the losses to our economy by having it inefficiently allocated, and then move on to the recent legislation recently passed by Congress in the extension of the payroll tax holiday bill, and discuss what Congress in its wisdom is deciding to do. So let's begin with the broadcast spectrum. How is it currently allocated? When was this decided, and how did we get here?
Well, thanks very much for having me, first of all, Harold, and it's an honor to be here at the Hudson Institute and talk about one of our favorite topics. You called me the world's greatest expert, I think, on broadcast spectrum. Just the other day, I was showing my daughters one of my favorite clips from the 1970s. There's now a great YouTube of Professor Irwin Corey, the world's greatest expert on all topics. So I'll try to live up to that billing as we move forward. I don't know if you know Professor Irwin Corey, but remember one of the great routines of the 60s and 70s. I know you're all anxious about the big party tomorrow for the 85th anniversary of the Radio Act of 1927, signed by Calvin Coolidge, who would think that just 85 years later we'd all be here talking about the implications of the public interest spectrum allocation system. Still with us, and in fact going strong, nearly a century on. So we have this 85-year-old spectrum allocation system that in the 1940s and early 50s carved out what became the TV allocation table of 1952. And based upon the management system that the FCC itself now refers to as command and control, it put in place a system for walling off a very large chunk of VHF and UHF spectrum, very valuable decades later, not all that valuable in the 40s and 50s, but it walled off a very significant band of frequencies for over-the-air broadcast television. Originally, it was 81 channels, 6 megahertz each, nearly 500 megahertz total. And then that was sort of peeled off in the 1970s, and some of the spectrum there went to cellular. And then again in the digital TV transition that culminated with the turnoff of analog TV stations in June 2009. We were able to peel off a few more, go down from 67 to the current 49 channels. But we still have walled off 49 channels of prime radio spectrum, according to what regulators saw as an important service in 1952. So it's not too hard to figure out what's wrong with this picture. Because of the rigidities of that allocation, we continue to not only resist the temptation to allow other emerging services, things that weren't around 60 years ago, to use that very valuable spectrum, but we force broadcasters into a business model that was imposed multiple generations ago. Now, people think it's been liberalized because we have made a transition from analog to digital, and some rules were liberalized. Broadcast stations are allowed to either broadcast in high definition or to have a multiplex, so they can have 5 or 6 channels of standard definition television go out over the air. And there is some liberalization in terms of leasing the use of those channels for content not produced by the station or controlled by the station, and so forth and so on. But the fact of the matter is, the basic structure of that industry that uses TV licenses is still very tightly controlled relative to what the market would do in the absence of those restrictions. That is to say, every TV station has to broadcast a high-powered signal that covers all 6 megahertz assigned to the license. They're not able to peel that back to share their spectrum, to make deals with other companies, say to do two-way mobile services that clearly seems to be what's rising in demand over the last many years in terms of use of that prime spectrum. They're stuck. And so as we look around the world, we, trying to get more efficiencies and some growth for our economy, this is just one of the obvious areas to look at. And so I do commend the broadband plan, folks, the National Broadband Plan report in March of 2010, for focusing, given the mission to talk about broadband, what we can do in terms of public policy to advance the growth of broadband markets and broadband availability for the American people. They really did focus in a very sharp way on the imperative of getting more access to prime bandwidth for the mobile market, in particular, trying to free up television bandwidth to do something more valuable. I just want to make one thing clear. Broadcasters still have very valuable content that is distributed and creates value. But it's the platform, the actual terrestrial broadcast platform, that has become largely obsolete. That's obviously because of the growth of cable and satellite. Now, clearly more than 90% of what we call television viewing is not delivered by over-the-air broadcast television. And in fact, over-the-air broadcast by terrestrial stations is now 2 generations behind, because the emerging transition is for content to go what's called over the top through broadband distribution. So it's not really an argument. Sometimes people say, well, you're criticizing broadcasters, you don't like their model. Not at all. Look at what broadcasters do. ABC, Disney, when they have new valuable video content, how do they distribute it? Do they distribute it by over-the-air terrestrial broadcasting on these many digital sub-channels they have on many of the stations they own or contract with as part of the ABC broadcasting network? Of course not. They put ESPN on cable. They put ESPN2, ESPN Classic, ESPN News, all on cable. Now, for ESPN3, they've gone to broadband. So that's a broadband distributed signal. Okay, so broadcasters themselves, when they have new content, are going to cable. And this is, of course, a long and even mature process at this point in time. And, reading the trends in the marketplace are absolutely clear. Terrestrial broadcasting has very low value as a video delivery system relative to the opportunity cost of the spectrum it consumes. And so, as an economist, or just as a person interested in, in good rules for the American public, one would have to say that locking in that 1952 allocation makes no sense today.
If you look at the spectrum allocations of different countries around the world, one thing that strikes me is the American allocation is this patchwork quilt with lots and very small allocations all over the place. Does this put the United States at an advantage or a disadvantage relative to other countries in having lots of very small allocations?
Well, the fragmentation in the U.S. market, which is a policy undertaken explicitly by U.S. regulators, is a big problem for the U.S. market. Now, over time, it's become less of a market because we do have fairly liberal rules on secondary markets. And when you look around the world, do the global analysis you were referring to, and you look at how many licenses have been issued by regulatory authorities, say for mobile services, you know, you'll see 4, 5, 8. Brazil has, I think, 12 areas that they license in. Then you come to the U.S., and I actually counted the number of licenses used in the mobile market. I should have refreshed my memory for this talk. It's over 50,000. It's over 50,000. And according to the Department of Justice, we only have 4 national networks. So the correct number was somewhere around 4, and they missed by something like over 50,000. Say, well, the secondary market was allowed to aggregate those licenses, those fragmentary rights, and put them together in regional or national networks, which are very important for mobile services. I mean, this is not rocket science. Mobile services. You want the mobile services to be allowed to aggregate over large areas, because that's kind of what mobile services want to do. So yes, around the world, there actually has been more of an understanding that national licenses, a small number, get them in the market. Now, some of those authorities internationally have not been as liberal as the United States in other areas. And so, I think that we have a lot to be happy with in the way things have gone in the U.S., allowing secondary market transactions, even things like the famous aggregation of, taxi dispatch licenses to create Nextel, which was not an FCC initiative, but the FCC said yes when asked. Could this network constructed out of different licenses become a cellular network? They said yes to that. So there's been a lot of entrepreneurship in the U.S. and a lot of activity to make up for this fragmentation. Now, in a certain sense, that's wasted activity. If the government had allowed an allocation system of licenses or rights initially that allowed the aggregation, like having an auction where you can have combination bids and so forth, fairly straightforward mechanisms to do this that the economists have worked out, we would have saved ourselves a lot. I'll also say that on the reallocation of TV spectrum, it may be shocking, but we seem to be ahead of much of the world because we at least did push forward after the digital TV transition, and we did make spectrum available for mobile players to bid on in auctions and then use productively. And a lot of that spectrum is coming into the market now. And 4G services are doing fairly well in the U.S. relative to other countries. We're actually an international leader there, and that has to do with leading the way. But all countries seem to have some of these rigidities. Almost all countries seem to have very similar rigidities in their spectrum allocation systems, and many of them follow the United States. And so I just have to quickly tell a story. I was at a conference in Europe about 3 months ago, and there was a consultant that came from a small Middle Eastern country, and they said they were trying to do a digital dividend. So that's what it's called now internationally. You do a digital dividend to get TV spectrum into the mobile market. Well, digital dividend means the broadcasters convert analog digital. They don't need as much spectrum, so therefore the government takes some spectrum back, gives it to the mobile market. It's a very, again, bureaucratic and top-down way to look at things. But now apparently the United States, having done some of that over the last, 27 years, it's really started, digital TV transition started in 1985. The United States has looked to, be a leader because we did it so fast. And anyway, so there's one small Middle Eastern country that actually has 97% satellite penetration, satellite video penetration. Over-the-air television is trivial. Because over-the-air viewing is trivial, the actual broadcast stations that exist don't want to make the investment in digital facilities. So because they won't invest in digital facilities, they can't have a digital TV transition, hence no digital dividend. I raised my hand at this conference and said, well, why don't we subsidize households to go off satellite and go back on over-the-air viewing? Maybe we can send, mail them DVDs, give them free Netflix subscriptions or something so they don't miss their satellite. And then there'll be enough over-the-air audience to justify this investment in more expensive broadcasting facilities that nobody actually wants to watch. And you can get your digital TV spectrum dividend. Okay, so that's how backwards. That's how backwards it is. When you've already made a transition to the next generation of video distribution, as they have in this particular country, where satellite takes in almost everybody. The last 3% probably aren't watching a lot of TV. And you could obviously subsidize the last 3% to go on satellite. That's the easy answer. But at a relatively low cost. And then just sweep off the entire TV band and sell that to the highest valued use. By the way, you don't have to preclude broadcasters from bidding on that spectrum and continuing to broadcast if they want to do that. But given the relative values, it's unlikely that there would be much of that. Might be some, not much. Anyway, that's where we are. We get locked into these kinds of models, and we don't, I want to start to say, we don't think outside the box. We don't even think towards the edge of the box. Okay, we seem trapped in a very small space to think that we're tied down to something that happened in 1952.
Well, you mentioned secondary markets. If someone here owned a broadcast television license, why couldn't they just sell it to a mobile broadband company? The private asset, private property, there's a market for it. Why not just do that?
Well, they can. It has all transactions, of course, that involve a transfer of a license have to be authorized by the Federal Communications Commission, but those authorizations are fairly straightforward. The problem is that the mobile broadband company can't do anything but television. They have to continue broadcasting. Now, the content that is broadcast does not have to be quote-unquote television. You can do data software, or data, or you can do software uploads or downloads. But you have to broadcast. You have to send a high-powered signal from a fixed location at a fixed height on a fixed technology as prescribed in the license, blasting it out at high power, covering all 6 megahertz. Anything else you want to do, you can't. Well, there's not much you can do after that other than just do what they're doing now, which is they have a primary channel. All the TV stations have a primary channel, and that remains very valuable because it gives them either must-carry or retransmission consent rights to sell to the cable and satellite operators and get retransmitted. Okay, that's the efficient distribution system. And then the other signals, many of the transmitters have 4 or 5 other signals, subchannels, digital subchannels. They're carrying some programming, but they're not profitable, not nearly profitable. And they're certainly not generating anywhere near, in terms of economic value, what mobile broadband would render, certainly in UHF and almost certainly in VHF as well. So it's just a misallocation because of the rigidity of the rules. And the TV stations at this point in time do not have change of use rights. They do have license transfer rights, more or less. They do not have change of use rights.
Last week, Congress passed a new law as part of the Payroll Tax Holiday Act. And as part of that, the Commission was given new auction authority, and also authority to have reverse auctions for broadcast spectrum. Could you describe what Congress did?
Sure, and I think many people in the room are familiar with this because this has been the big marquee attraction in spectrum policy over the last year and a half, or 2 years, since the National Broadband Plan came out in March 2010. It had a proposal, some might call it a roadmap, to get an additional 300 megahertz in spectrum into the market in 5 years by 2015, and then another, 300 by 2020, and or excuse me, another 200 by 2020. But the big ticket item there is to reallocate, as the FCC says, up to 120 megahertz of the TV band. So, remembering where we left the television band in 2009 to present, we have 49 TV channels, 49 TV channels in every one of the 210 TV markets in America. And each channel is allocated 6 megahertz. And we have about 1,800 full-power TV stations. So that's somewhere around, on average, if you don't adjust by population, about 8 channels per market. 1,800 divided by 210. Or is that 9? 9. So the FCC says, look, we want to recover up to 120, and let's just call it 120 in this discussion for sake of conversation. And so we're going to take down the TV band from 49 channels to 29 channels. TV will be left with what's 174 megahertz, and we'll strip out this 120, and then we'll allocate it to new licenses, some portion of it. Again, let's just call it 120. We'll put the 120 on new licenses and sell them off to the highest bidder, and they will have flexible use rights, which means mobile operators or broadcasters or other wireless service vendors can do what they will. There's a presumption that mobile communications, mobile broadband, mobile voice are the highest valued uses, and the companies providing those services would be the top bidders in the auction. So to get the 120 megahertz, to pry off 20 channels, to clear out channels 31 through 51 that now have TV stations sitting on them in some markets, the FCC is going to have what amounts to a two-stage auction process. The first stage is a reverse auction. And in the reverse auction, TV stations are asked, what would you take as an offer to vacate this space, to just go off the air? And there are a couple of other alternative choices. What would it take for you to share a signal with one other station? If they get 2 stations to say we'll share, that's the same as taking 1 full station off the air. Then they will take the bids, and the FCC will then have the costs of actually taking TV stations off the air. Then nothing happens right away. The FCC has the bid information. That's the reverse auction. The FCC calls it an incentive auction, which is kind of a funny name for it. I'll explain why it's called that in a minute, if I remember. But the FCC takes the data on what it's going to cost to move out some TV stations. Then the FCC goes to its war room and goes to the FCC computers, and they get the pot boiling. They have a little secret sauce they throw in there, and they look at what these 1,800 TV stations are doing, and particularly which stations are on channels 31 to 51, and what they bid to move out of broadcasting altogether, and then which stations are left, and then they're going to do something that is not voluntary, but it's called relocation. And they will move stations either off the air completely, according to their bids, and they're going to take the low bids, obviously, and then move the rest of the stations that made higher bids or no bids at all, moved those stations down to somewhere south of channel 31. 31 or and then they're not supposed to, by this legislation, go down into VHF territory, channels 2 through 13, so it'll be somewhere between 14 and 31. Now, there's going to be this TV stations to be moved on their channel assignments. If you're on channel 40 and you have to go to channel 30, you have to buy some new electronics or tweak some things. There's a fund for relocation. And in the House bill that I read, and I don't know if this is what became law, there was a $3 billion, up to a $3 billion relocation. Is that what finally became law? The $3 billion relocation? Was 1.7? 1.7 was the alternative. Okay. So there's a $1.7 billion budget. By the way, that budget is to be funded by what comes in the next round of auction. And so there is relocate. The FCC is going to determine what the actual expenses are. There could be some arbitration involved there to try to get some third-party adjudication to quickly clear up disagreements. And after that plan is introduced, the FCC will have, when the dust clears, come up with 20 channels, which are now allocated to television, each allocated 6 megahertz, and that's 120 megahertz total, and they will be able to use up to 120 megahertz to allocate to new licenses. Those licenses can be sold. We've done that several times. That seems to be the straightforward part of this. It's also called a forward auction because the rights come in the future. So after those bids are taken, the FCC does have a little bit of work to do there, which is to make sure all the money fits, that the bids to clear the band, the bids for the new licenses pay for the costs in clearing the band, both the relocation costs and the monies that have gone to the TV stations in the first round, the so-called reverse auction. Okay. Now, the reason it's called an incentive auction is because the TV stations aren't just being asked for the bids, what it would take to vacate. There's also an implicit, not so implicit threat. If you don't sell, if you don't state a price and be taken off the air, you're going to be stuck with a TV license. So your incentive is to get out of Dodge. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. One, it's bad public policy to commit the United States government to bad public policy. And forcing TV stations to be TV stations on the business models imposed in law in 1952 is bad policy. Secondly, stations can't all get out of, no matter if they have incentives or not, they can't all get out of this. The number of stations that are actually purchased and taken off the air may be somewhere around 200 out of the 1,800. Okay, it could be as low, I've seen estimates of 100 to 400. But the great majority of TV stations are going to stay where they are now, broadcasting on the old model. And they're going to be on 174 megahertz, 29 channels, going forward on an implicit bargain with regulators that they have to stay there for some number of years to pay them back for not selling out when they had their chance. They didn't take the incentive. They didn't bid low enough to get out. So that's why it's called an incentive auction. And that's a funny way to rig the incentives because it doesn't really solve the basic problem of liberalizing the entire ban, something you just referred to when you talked about liberalizing the licenses and let TV stations voluntarily leave.
Now, in a lot of the 210 designated market areas, are there in fact already 29 operating television stations? In many of those markets, aren't there fewer already?
Yeah, in almost all of them, of course. So it depends on how you count. If you count low power, depends on how you draw the circles around does New York City, how much of New Jersey does New York City market, how much of the spillovers does it count? According to the FCC, you do get up, I think, to 28 in the city of New York. And Los Angeles has a lot of stations, certainly San Francisco Bay Area, because you got a lot going on in a fairly concentrated area around San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland. So, yeah, you get a high number in many, and of course, in most parts of the country, particularly when you get out of the top 40 markets, you're going to have fairly few stations that need to be purchased. Maybe no stations out of the top 40 markets need to be purchased. You can simply have the relocation, move all the channels, all the stations that are on channels 31 to 51 south.
Based on your experience in watching proceedings at the commission, could you give us some sense of how long you think all this will take?
No. You know, my sense is that it will take a long time. Yeah, it is humorous that at least the version of that House bill that I read gives the FCC until 2021 to do this. You know, the National Broadband Plan was talking about getting the incentive auctions done by 2015. I think the FCC still wants to shoot for that, and because speed is consumer welfare, I hope that they are expeditious and then it does go smoothly. But certainly, one of the problems you have now is that this very regulatory intensive approach, which is quite limited. If the FCC does everything it proposes, you're still going to have a big majority of the TV band allocated, 174 of the 294 megahertz, still allocated to television, and you're stuck for something like, you know, maybe another decade, maybe another generation, because you've said that part of the incentive plan is to leave the other stuff there allocated to TV. Now, some people might say, well, the FCC, the regulators can always renege on that. But they've set in place and set in motion, if motion is the right word, government inaction, a commitment to have over-the-air broadcasting for many years out into the future, certainly far past 2015, when maybe the incentive auction spectrum, 120 megahertz or up to that, comes out into the mobile market. And that's, you know, that again, that's giving, you know, having far too much deference to the TV allocation table of 1952. I mean, it's high time we allowed the entire band to be used in its highest value, highest socially valuable use. And there's just no question that broadcasting could become a lot more efficient by using a lot less spectrum. And in fact, maybe, I don't know this answer, I'd like to see the market show us, maybe no spectrum at all. And that last 174 megahertz is extremely valuable in mobile services and possibly other things. And we'd like to see that released in the market too. But there's no plausible plan there. There should be. And this is one of the things that really is disappointing about the incentive auction, sucking the oxygen out of seemingly all other spectrum allocation reform ideas. The commission and people who are looking to the future really do have to focus on what comes next and how are we going to get to a point where we really can liberalize spectrum generally so that it doesn't get locked away for decades or generations in very low valued uses when very high valued uses are begging for bandwidth to supply the innovation and growth that is really central to the U.S. economy. You know, there's a very popular book out now that says, well, over the last 40 years, there hasn't been much growth in the U.S. market, not counting the internet and mobile. Okay, well, we're about to take care of mobile by the spectrum crunch. We shouldn't do that. We've had some successes in liberalization, certainly the entire regime switch from broadcast licenses to mobile licenses is a big success in the U.S. and many other markets. That is to say, when you ask me about the broadcast TV license, and I say, well, he's got all these restrictions, virtually every one of those restrictions is gone in the mobile license. Okay, you're able to do broadcasting type stuff. You're able to do different business models. The TV license says you have to have free over-the-air broadcasting. You can't be subscription only. So you don't have business model restrictions in the mobile life. You don't have technology restrictions. You don't have services restrictions and things like, you know, even the smartphone revolution and the App Store. They come right into that space, or M2M, the entire machine-to-machine explosion in mobile. All this stuff comes into that space without any kind of regulatory overhead. It just, boom, contracts with the carriers who have liberal use of the spectrum allocated to their licenses. And so we've had some big successes there, but really we have to have a much bolder approach to regulatory reform. The incentive auction is being talked about as a template for future reallocations. God forbid. This is going to take a long time. It's going to feature the FCC at the center of everything. And in many ways, it's a step back because we have done a much more liberal reallocation in the many instances where the FCC has used overlay licenses to auction off broad secondary rights to a band, and then to grandfather the existing licensees so that they can continue operating. This was done, for example, in PCS, and then with government users, which create their own problems, but it was successful relative to the alternatives, highly successful in AWS. The licenses were auctioned in 2006. Anyway, we let the overlay licensees pay their money to the Treasury, and then they go and have broad liberal rights, and they can make deals with all the grandfathered licensees that are already there, and they can make full use of that radio spectrum. They can make all kinds of business deals with the incumbents to move them, reform them so they use less spectrum or clear them out. And they're business partners. They're not adversaries. These deals can happen fairly rapidly. Things are tougher when you have government institutions, nonprofits, agencies that don't respond to the profit incentive. That is tougher. And you have to come up, you got to put your thinking cap on to figure that out. And there has been some progress on that as well through arbitration principles and so forth. But when you've got broadcast stations owned by private parties, and you've got the possibility to then put another overlay on top of them so that private parties can deal with each other, change the use of radio spectrum, and create something more valuable, believe me, markets know how to make those deals, and they know how to split gains from trade. Stuff that takes the FCC 5 or 10 years can get done in 2 or 3 months on Wall Street, private equity coming in, all kinds of alliances being made, and boom, you're off to the races. And this is just not well understood by the regulators, certainly by the legislators, or even by many of the policy pundits that have been commenting on this. There are other ways to go. The incentive auction plan now is the only game in town, so it's worth pushing that forward rapidly to get it done, to get that spectrum in the market. But there should be other games in town, and there should be a plan B and a plan C. There should be a lot of stuff out there where people aren't saying, when is this going to happen? Is it 2015? Is it 2020? People should be saying, we've got this, and we've got this, and there's going to be a race on between these alternative models. So, 2 years have passed since the broadband plan came out and had this roadmap for 300 megahertz to come out. Nothing's come out of the 300. There's been a step back on some of it, apparently, that was scheduled in the near term because of interference problems that the FCC has not been able to resolve. And it's taken 2 years to get legislation. Legislation is a big transaction cost. And there are a lot of people very critical about all the process and all the stuff that happened in the Congress with all the restrictions on the FCC and all the side issues that came in. The complaints have been lodged, however, by many who were arguing to go to Congress for new authority. When overlay authority was already vested at the agency decided to do something quite a bit more ambitious in terms of regulatory management of the process. And when you go to Congress for new authority, you're going to get more than new authority. You're going to get a process. And to be honest, the FCC lucked out. They actually got a bill in 2 years. And they got authority. And I did increase my personal wealth by making a bet that authority would not come in 2011. I haven't figured out where I'm going to spend that $10. But they got very lucky. If they hadn't gotten it this time around, it might have been a few years before that authority had come. You know, it was hanging by a thread. It got in there. Well, okay, congratulations. Let's get that thing done. And let's try to make the rules simple, transparent, and speedy. Okay? And I hope it does get done. But I hope other plans come out that are much less regulatory intensive, that can think more globally about getting all kinds of bans out, not just the TV ban.
Are there estimates of the economic welfare losses from keeping spectrum out of use?
I didn't tell you to ask me that, but thank you very much. So, yeah,
I only asked the questions that you told me to ask.
Wait a minute, that was number 6. You're supposed to ask number 4. Yeah, I have done some work on these kinds of questions with a great economist who's now down in Santiago, Chile, Roberto Munoz, and happy to share with folks who want to see the articles. But we took a look, for example, at to what. Well, let's back up for a second. It just turns out that the marginal value of radio spectrum in the market for liberal licenses is extremely high. Now, I'm glad that the reaction of most of you, and I can read your minds, the reaction is, tell us something we don't know. You think I'm wasting your time with that. Well, when we did this research starting 2003, 4, 5, there really was quite a debate on as to whether or not, quote unquote, more spectrum was needed in the market. And there was all kinds of policy debate over how to do this. Were liberal licenses really important? And it was actually quite a different world. And I'm very happy that discussion has moved forward. And I give some credit to, as I said before, to the National Broadband Plan. But anyway, so we did one study. We had global data on prices and spectrum, and we basically were just looking, when you add more spectrum to a market, what happens, somewhat of a lag, but what happens to retail prices and minutes of use, output. And there's a substantial effect, and so you can come back with those sorts of models and actually ask the question, if you take 30 megahertz out of the U.S. market, or you add 30 megahertz to the U.S. market, say in 1995, how much extra consumer surplus and producer surplus, social welfare, will be added to the U.S. economy by, say, the year 2005, over 10 years? Well, we actually ran it through, I think, 2003. We had about a $70 billion number for 30 megahertz added to the U.S. economy from 95 to 2003. Now, that was not a random run because, as many of you recall, something close to 30 megahertz had been, in essence, taken out of the U.S. market by all the, I think what Commissioner Harold Furchtgett-Roth called the C-block debacle. Was it the C-block fiasco or the C-block debacle? I'm trying to quote you correctly here. I'll go with both. The fiasco debacle of C-block, where the licensing rules were such that lots of firms ended up with the stuff and putting them into bankruptcy, and shell corporations ended up in bankruptcy, and the government couldn't get them back to re-auction them. Anyway, so there's 30 megahertz that was had been allocated, had been licensed, had been sold in the auctions, but in fact was not being productively used in the economy. And over that period, and conservatively estimated, we had about a $70 billion loss in welfare to the U.S. economy just from that increment. Well, that's a lot, and there's no reason to think that the margins are changing. In fact, with the smartphone revolution, the tablet, the new tablet phenomenon, demand for mobile bandwidth, as we all know, is growing. The mobile data tsunami, and so there's still a very healthy marginal valuation to more spectrum for mobile markets, and the numbers are big. And of course, a lot of, in the political world, you like to estimate jobs and so forth and so on. We actually estimated what economists like to estimate more often than not, which is welfare, and they're big numbers. And those big numbers at the margin continue to be there as our as our demand for bandwidth continues unabated.
And so keeping the broadcast spectrum out of its highest value use for an additional 5 or 10 years as an enormous drag on the economy.
Oh, absolutely. And, the numbers get so big. I mean, if you talk about the entire, broadcast, the TV band being allocated to its highest valued use, you literally do get numbers over $1 trillion. And when you get to $1 trillion, unless you're in a budget debate, when you get to $1 trillion, people tend to say, okay, it's a high number. That's all I understand. All of us, not just the non-economists. But no, it's a very big number. And of course, when you talk about the fact that it's really only 10 million households that don't have cable or satellite, okay, there are a lot of inflated numbers about how many off-the-air TV sets there are. Well, we have an off-the-air TV set in our house. Nobody ever watches it. Okay, but we're not, 25% off the air. That's the way they fabricate those numbers. So people have cable or satellite. There are basically 10 million households. And one of them might be the Furchgett-Roth household that doesn't have a television set, so it's not considered, deprived by the fact it doesn't have cable or satellite. But at any rate, if we really wanted to force you, Harold, to have a satellite dish and to hook it up for you, we could do that for $300, less than $300 wholesale, certainly. And that's $3 billion for 10 million households. And that just takes everybody off over-the-air television. Okay, they may have an internal wiring issue to get all those TV sets connected to the satellite dish or the cable box. But the fact is that at a very low price, we can produce very high benefits. And it is political paralysis, regulatory inertia that keeps us from thinking boldly about how to get that big last step.
And with that, let me first thank Professor Hazlett. We're going to open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take questions from the audience. Mr. Udd.
In this legislation,
If you could,
Jerry Udwin with the Udwin Group. Tom, in the legislation that passed, it did, of course, not set any limits on eligibility for these incentive auctions, but it did say something about how the commission could, if it devised rules that covered the whole wireless industry, could come up with something that supposedly furthers competition in terms of licensing. Where do you think that fits into the licensing process? You expect the commission will do that before the spectrum auctions or later, or what influence will you think it have?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's a very confused area right now, of course, and there's been these ad hoc runs at trying to limit, through different licensing policies, trying to limit access to radio spectrum. The problem we have now, obviously, is that and this is just a standard problem around the world, is that the largest networks have, on efficiency grounds, the most intense demand for more spectrum. And it's patently obvious, although maybe the antitrust regulators, they sometimes miss this, that the motivation to accumulate more spectrum is not to warehouse it, which you wouldn't do anyway, even if you did want to restrict output. You'd still use it, you just use it not so intensively. But the larger carriers, and we have, of course, a market that is characterized by two large companies relative to Sprint and T-Mobile. We have, Verizon and AT&T that the government is, fond of pointing out, got these big networks. But they have intense demand for spectrum because their customers intensely use spectrum. And you can divide it up in megahertz per customer, megahertz per smartphone user, and so forth, and see that they are spectrum constrained just as much as the smaller network. To deprive them of being able to get more spectrum is to impose a restriction of output on the market. And that's a very problematic thing when you have the most developed, efficient, and advantageous networks overall in terms of the sort of the lay of the land being restricted and have to come back and have to restrict output and raise price to some degree just to manage the network. So I'll give you an example from the non-U.S. So in Mexico a couple of years ago, They really do have a monopoly problem in Mexico. Okay, they got market power down there, with 72% of the cellular market being with one firm, Telcel, part of the spinoff of Telmix, and so they wanted to restrict, that big firm from getting too much more spectrum. So they put rules on that not only restricted Telcel from getting more spectrum, also had distinct limits on the second largest firm, which was Telefonica, that had 20% in the market. Now, if you're thinking that this was all rigged by Telmex, it's just natural. I don't know if it was or not. I have no idea, in fact. But the policy to restrict competition between large networks can have very anti-competitive consequences. And what the regulators really have to do is to sit back and really have some analytics on how the competition is working. Well, we know a lot about the competition amongst the carriers right now. It is vigorous, and they're not making profits. The wireless carriers are not making money. Okay, even the top firms are not making monopoly profits. Okay, Apple's doing well. Samsung seems to be doing pretty well. Thousands of developers seem to be getting a new business model in place that's very successful. But one of the interesting things is that you have small numbers competition. You're not going to have 30 or 40 cellular competitors. You're not even going to have 10. You look around the world, you just don't see that. Okay, you're going to have what they call small numbers competition between 3, 4, 5, whatever the numbers might be. And they compete vigorously, and a lot of what they have to do is they have to spend a lot of money to develop their networks. So they shell it out to technology providers and to the vendors. Okay, look what happened to Sprint. Okay, in October they finally got the iPhone, and to get the iPhone, they signed a deal that said they'd buy 30 million of them at an average price of $675. Sprint can't get anybody else to subsidize their iPhones. Okay, they'll subsidize it for their customers, but they're on the hook. So that's $20 billion. The market capitalization of Sprint was about $8 billion at the time. And their stock price went down 10%. When the contract was announced, of course, the CEO says, "Don't look at me. We've got to have the iPhone. It's a no-brainer. People want the iPhone. We've got to have it, or our network is going to be in even worse shape." And I don't know if that's right or wrong. I understand that he probably knows better than I do. But the market, didn't like that. So a lot of those profits are going elsewhere. I think regulators ought to understand what that means. There is a lot of competition there. And feeding spectrum into that market, you ought to allow that to go to the highest valued use. And we also have obviously some evidence from the auctions we've had lately. People point to the 2008 700 megahertz auction. AT&T and Verizon were the two big winners, and they've been developing 4G networks using that spectrum. Okay? It doesn't come online instantly, but it's coming on, and they are competing. They are using a lot of the spectrum. Go back to 2006. Who won that one? Well, T-Mobile. T-Mobile, that was extremely spectrum constrained and was really killed by U.S. spectrum policy in many ways. They were a leader with data early on with the BlackBerry and so forth, and they were just strangled by 2006. So they were the big winner and the big bidder. They got a lot of spectrum relative to anybody else. Verizon was in that auction. They got a pretty good chunk, but they paid a fairly high price. A new entrant, Spectrum Co., cable companies, they got in and bid, and they won 20 megahertz nationwide. They were the third largest. AT&T was not a big factor in that auction. So, Sprint's gone out. It's gotten a lot of spectrum through Clearwire. That puts it in a good position in terms of broadband. And they, interestingly enough, have over 11 million subscribers to Clearwire broadband now. And they've got an alliance there. Now, they got, big financial problems. They've got big competitive issues. But that's the way that market is. If it were, quote unquote, a cozy duopoly, it'd be a lot easier for Sprint They'd be in under the price umbrella. It'd be a lot easier for T-Mobile. And in fact, it'd be a lot easier perhaps for Verizon and AT&T. But that's not what you see there. You see a lot of competition. You may call it small numbers competition because you think maybe we should have 15 or 20 operators in the market. But that's not the economies of scale being what they are. This is the way you're going to see low prices. And of course, we do have in the U.S. fairly low prices, but maybe that's not an international comparison. But we're doing pretty well on technology upgrades. We're doing well in innovation. The smartphone revolution, less than 5 years old. The tablets are less than 2 years old. And so this is a market that's remarkably vibrant, but it does need spectrum. There's just no question about that. And, it's not a matter of how much they need. The exact answer, the FCC and other regulatory agencies around the world always, well, how much do they need? And I never lose an opportunity to say, I will tell you exactly how much they need. They need more. And if they have more, they can do a lot more, and they can have a lot more ambitious business models, and you get a lot more competition, even if you don't change the number of competitors. The extra capacity gives you more competition.
Next question.
Hi, this is Juliana Grunwald with National Journal. In the legislation that was passed on Friday, there was an option that for participating broadcasters, if they want to give up some of their spectrum, and I'm assuming share with the channel or whatever, they could opt for regulatory relief instead of cash. And I'm wondering if if that would allow them to do something different with their license other than broadcasting.
Well, yeah, I read that, and that is interesting. I haven't seen a lot of discussion on that. And I presume it does mean you can do something other than broadcast from your broadcast TV antenna.
It's an editorial note. I find it very troubling that there will be a statute that says a regulated licensee can give consideration to the government to return something to get a different regulatory structure. It's a very odd game. Next question. Here in the red.
Hi, Matthew Hussey with Senator Snow. Good to see you, Tom.
Matt.
You've been talking primarily about spectrum for licensed use, and I want to get your thoughts on the emergence of unlicensed and the significant use of Wi-Fi for offloading, where 40% of mobile data traffic is offloaded via Wi-Fi. I think in a couple years, 90% of smartphones will be Wi-Fi capable. And then if you look at tablets, I think close to 65% of tablet users use exclusively Wi-Fi connections only. So what role does unlicensed play in the whole valuation of spectrum and moving forward in trying to find a proper equilibrium between licensed and unlicensed?
Right. Yeah, no, so just in general, an argument is made, you need to have mixed use. You can't just have all licensed spectrum. You can't have all unlicensed. You need to have mixed use. Well, that's that's not understanding what the regulatory apparatus is actually doing. The regulatory apparatus restricts the mix of use by imposing certain rigidities that can't be fixed in the market. And there's no question that some of the spectrum being set aside for unlicensed by regulators is being productively used. But the problem is the regulatory system that does that. We don't know what the opportunity costs are when the government mandates that this is going to be used for unlicensed, because unlicensed cannot be put back together. Okay, there are too many dispersed rights of access and so forth. It's literally the broadcasting model in terms of regulation. You're setting aside a certain band, and then of course some people say it's a commons. It's not a commons. It's an administrative allocation. The rules, and it's not open access. The rules are set, power limits, and all the rest set by government. And you can have liberally licensed, what in this bill is called flexible use spectrum. You can have that spectrum used for what you're calling unlicensed, the unlicensed model. Okay, there's nothing stopping companies that want more bandwidth for say, home networking on an unlicensed basis, where power is restricted and you have, devices shooting, say, video around the house. Okay, so companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and so forth could go ahead and buy a license, and they could do that, and they could license products. The FCC actually, I need to give them credit for in some very measured ways, actually talking about this over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, the reason that we like, as economists, and we all as policy analysts, should like a licensed mechanism is because you have, with a license, a responsible economic agent that can update rules and set aside more spectrum for certain things or less spectrum, or move people around and make financial deals that increase the value of the spectrum. Okay? Now, a couple of examples. The TV band has turned into a junk band because of the rigidities of the rules. There's no responsible economic agent that can turn that spectrum around from one thing to another. Okay? You could go to Wall Street. I mean, if you own the TV band, you could easily just take everybody off, as we just talked about it a second ago, put them all on satellite or cable, all the homes, and you could turn that thing into a flourishing marketplace of extra value, trillions of dollars of social value. But you can't do that because of the rigidities. Well, that's unlicensed. Now, you can give me examples of unlicensed bands that have a very popular, like the 2.4 gigahertz band that hosts a lot of Wi-Fi, or the 900 band that does a lot of cordless phone around the house. I can also give you unlicensed PCS that didn't go anywhere and just been vacant for 20 years. Or 3650 that's not being utilized. What were some of the other unlicensed bands?
5 gigahertz.
Well, some of the 5 gigahertz is very little used and so forth. But the problem is not that it's at any one time used or unused. The problem is, if there's something good to do with that bandwidth, it's very hard to make a deal to move that spectrum into an alternative use. So the other example I give is this controversy between Light Squared and GPS. So Light Squared wants to make more productive use of this bandwidth in the L band, and they get permission to do that, and the ancillary terrestrial component, in other words, mobile broadband. And their neighbors are going to have a conflict with this, and there's nobody they can go to in the GPS band and say, here, we want to make a deal. They went to the FCC, and it was all political, and they lost. That's just it. Now, according to Light Squared, they could replace all these radios that have a problem with them. And they could still make a fortune developing to its full valued use the L band for mobile broadband. We know that that's worth something because they put a reported $4 billion into developing it. So they think it's worth a lot more than $4 billion. And they say the fix on these radios and GPS is a very small fix, relatively speaking, maybe $100 million. You might have the numbers at the tip of your tongue. But it's certainly a lot less than the value of the L band, but the L band is shot now because there's nobody in that band that they can deal with. You say, well, it's more efficient to have an unlicensed thing where we have GPS rules and the government runs all that. Really? I think that there could be a band manager over there, or some institutional change that actually allows transactions to be made so that the GPS band doesn't continue, in essence, using up in a very costly way all the surrounding spectrum. And then if there's some upgrades, some technological upgrades that need to take place, some receiver upgrades or whatever, that the economic incentives are there to do that. But that's a huge failure. People call that, by the way, a market failure. You couldn't have a worse term. Okay, it's exactly the way the rights are designed. So unlicensed bandwidth is very popular, and some of it's very valuable. And certainly the offload, if you're a wireless network, of course you're going to offload stuff around the house. You say they're offloading to wireless, to Wi-Fi. I say they're offloading to DSL and cable modems. Okay, but you can use Wi-Fi. It's a handy cordless PC kind of a device. The predictions were 10 years ago that unlicensed bands, by the way, would take over in the wide area network space. You'd have ad hoc mesh networks going everywhere. There's nothing stopping that. You can have mobile broadband, mobile voice delivered just on Wi-Fi, just on unlicensed bands. It's just expensive to do it that way. It doesn't do anything. With the power limits and everything the government does to police and try to prevent tragedy in the unlicensed bands, it turns out it works in many instances for local area networks. And that's what we've seen develop. And those local area networks are complementary to wide area networks. The wide area networks are not run on an unlicensed basis, I can assure you. All those networks are owned spectrum, whether they be wide area wireless networks or wide area fixed networks. Okay? So it turns out that wide area stuff is a lot more complicated because there's a lot more conflicts that can happen. Local area stuff, a lot fewer conflicts. You can just put on some power limits and hope for the best. And sometimes some good stuff really does happen there. And we've seen that in Wi-Fi and cordless phones. But that is not a good general coordinating principle for the whole spectrum. And there's been great confusion on this. I was very happy to see the National Broadband Plan get past a lot of that confusion. Maybe we're sinking back into it now. We say, well, it's one or the other. What I'd like to see is a very liberal policy on licensed spectrum, and there are no impediments that I know about for using licensed spectrum to expand bandwidth for unlicensed bands, but if there are impediments, they should be stripped away, and we should get those models to compete. Now, the last thing I'll say about this, if you actually look at what the mobile networks are, they operate in many respects quite similarly to unlicensed bands. Okay, now they do have a host, they have a carrier that does a lot of this coordination, they have a responsible economic agent, and they pour money into fixed infrastructure for the wide area network. But they have a lot of sharing. The most intensively shared spectrum in terms of economic value, without question, is in the liberal licenses. That's what's driving, by the way, the big increase in Wi-Fi. Okay, it's this development and the massive infrastructure spending to develop the wide area networks, and a complement to it is the local offload, just as you suggest, to local Ethernet or DSL and cable modem. But the mobile network, people say, well, we don't see anything like the unlicensed. Well, of course it is. There's all kinds of plug and play wireless devices you can stick right in the spectrum, and of course the mobile carriers coordinate a lot of that. But there's a lot of other players outside that space, whether it be Apple or OnStar, General Motors, that just come in and they contract with the carriers to use that spectrum. And so there are a lot of devices, in the whole M2M explosion, that's come into that space where you have liberal licenses conferring de facto property rights in the spectrum to these competitive carriers in the market, and then all of them are trying to optimize the value of spectrum. And that's what we need more of. So in terms of more set-asides for unlicensed, I tend to be quite negative on that.
And with that, Professor Hazlett, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll talk to you long.